having tea, I believe, so I know that's extremely important, so someone will wave at us, no doubt. This is my great pleasure. My name's Tanya Thomson, most of you know me, to introduce Barbara Sumner. Barbara is the author of a recent memoir. Would you describe it as a memoir? Is that a good word?
I guess, yeah.
We might come back to that.
Yeah.
For the moment, it's a book called Tree of Strangers. Barbara also has a long history in the arts and filmmaking, magazine feature writing, and some more things coming in the future, I know. I just saw that. Barbara's book is about adoption, but it's about a lot more than adoption. So this session is a bit of a quite wide-ranging. It's a bit literary, but it's also about issues, some quite deep issues. So we'll probably skip back and forth a bit from the book and a bit about the things that brings up. And some of you in the room may have experience of adoption, and there are many ways in which people can have an experience or connection to adoption. And of course, some of you may not, and we're interested in people's views and questions from all perspectives. I'd also like to start with what this is not. A lot of adoption stories focus on the search for a birth parent. You've definitely probably seen those TV things where, you know, there's this huge mystery unravels, and at the end there's an unveiling. Usually it's the mother, and the climax of the story is the reuniting of mother and child. This is not what happens to you.
It is not. I mean, we call that, within adoption communities, we call that reunion porn. And it's and it becomes it's certainly the way that many people interact into adoption stories is through that idea of reunion. But it's a very flawed it's a flawed way to understand the issues, because it's kind of, I mean, it's often a happy story, or it's a tragic story, but we never understand what the depth of it is.
So for people, by the way, there will be spoilers about this book. I really recommend you read it, but there will be spoilers if you haven't read it yet. But very early on in the book, it becomes clear why you will never meet your mother, your original mother. Can you explain to us that part of the story?
If I have to.
Briefly. It is quite important.
Yes, I think it is. When I was 23, I had children. I suppose I can say this on the camera, is that I had children very early, really in order to not kill myself. It was a way of giving me a reason to keep going in my life, because I didn't. I'd heard there was a dropped hint that I'd remembered from my teenage years, and I followed that through and surprisingly found her. Now, she was through a third party, and she was living in Madrid. The woman who knew her contacted her. She booked her flight and to leave Madrid the next day. She got on the plane, and the plane crashed. So we didn't, I always like to say that fast, because I know it's kind of shocking, but it's also just we all have things in our lives that we have to get through. So that was one of them.
And when I read the book, I thought, you couldn't have made this up, because if you'd written the book making this up, everyone would have been, that's just so melodramatic, Barbara, really? And when I read it, it was like this gut punch. But it's also very powerful, because it does, I hate to use your mother's death as a metaphor, but it is a bit of a symbol that your story in a lot of ways is about ongoing loss. And this was not the first loss and not the last one. Can you tell me a bit about how adoption was lost for you?
Well, I think adoption is made from loss. First of all, the mother loses her child for whatever reason, and there are so many reasons and circumstances that mothers end up losing their child, their children. For the adopted person, and then for the person who's adopting, frequently they're adopting because they're infertile, so they've lost the opportunity of having their own child. And most people, certainly back in the earlier days of adoption, they wanted, this was the adopted child is not the child. The adopted person is a child, and this child is acquired to resolve that infertility. So there is a huge loss there for the adopting mother as well, particularly. And then for the person who's adopted, well, they've lost everything. They've lost their extended family, they've lost their history, they've lost their ancestors, they've lost siblings, they've lost something called genetic mirroring, where you often grow up in a family where nobody looks like you, no one has your voice or your interest or your ears or, the most simplest things. So you lose the intangible things that make us who we are and where we fit within society.
I think that's really powerful, and I'd like to bring in the first of many Jewish elements. In fact, I have to mention that the first Jewish element was the clue you referred to about your mother, who was a model. You knew she was a model. That was about all you knew about her, wasn't it?
That was it, yeah.
And so who do you end up talking to about your mother being a model? It's Maisie Bestel-Cohen, who I think many of you will be familiar with that name, which just, New Zealand is such a small place, really, which I guess was a plus and that enabled you to find your mother.
It was the first, that clue. I was 13 and behaving very badly. I'd been a very compliant child, which is very common in adopted people. We are often in a state of stasis, withdrawal, and there's a lot of scientific and psychological understanding of of how the adopted person reacts. And so I heard this, and I was suddenly a teenager and I was acting out terribly, and I overheard my adopting mother and her sister, who had actually trafficked me, who had organized the adoption completely illegally, and she said, talking about my behavior, well, what do you expect? Her mother was a model. So that was my only piece of information, and from that I did manage to put it all together. Maisie then told me about someone else that she knew that was involved with models in 1959, 1960, and it went from there.
And this is where I'd like to talk on the next thing that I felt when I first talked to Barbara about, when I read her book and then talked to her about her story, that was so Jewish. And it came up in the last session that many of you were also in with Gigi Fenster. So I'd actually like to read this because I took a photo of the quote on the wall. So excuse me using my phone, and I also have to take my glasses off because I've got middle-aged problems. She said, I may not be writing in a Jewish American tradition, but I do play with identity. And playing with identities and double allegiance is, in my view, the fundamentally Jewish obsession. Now, of course, when this was being discussed, it wasn't about the double identity of adoption, but the double allegiance of adoption. But that really, I turned around and looked at you and really brought up your story, because as well as a search for identity, there was an issue of allegiance, which you refer to in your book as the issue, that the double bind that almost all children in your position find themselves in.
Well, adopted people do find themselves in that position because there's a thing that goes with adoption, which is being grateful, and you're brought up with this idea that somehow you must be grateful for these people that have taken you in, and that's completely separate from any understanding of the circumstances or the wider, not even the individual circumstances of a mother and her child, but the social circumstances as well, of how we set up women to lose their babies, and the whole social engineering of the nuclear family, and how an infertile couple is not part of the nuclear family, and how a single mother doesn't fit that either. And so the social structures that we put in place to ensure that broader situation. But then we also, like the idea that I had an identity that was not adopted, that was a whole person in my own right, that never came up as I was growing up. I was always the adopted person or the adopted child. And again, we use that word child all the time. And I've got the stack of judgments of people trying to get access their adoption files over the years, which is still illegal. And, judges saying things like, you're an adopted child of any age. So you're infantilized throughout your life. And I'm 61, and I did go to court, and I was one of maybe 10 or 20 people in this country who've managed to access their files. And, it's really unusual. We are not allowed to know about ourselves, whether it doesn't matter what culture we are. But then there's also that idea that who you are culturally and genetically matters, and it does come up. And all I've been hearing, like last night, and everyone's stories, everyone's talking about their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents, their Holocaust stories, you know, their stories of survival. These are the stories that make us who we are. And as an adopted person, you don't have that. You have no ancestors. You legally have no ancestors. You are not legally the grandchildren of your adopted parents. So you don't legally have siblings. Then you might grow up with people, but they're not your legal siblings. So you exist in a bubble.
So it's very interesting because when I read this, and it made me think about the Adoption Act, which for those of you who don't know is a very old 1955 piece of legislation. The government is looking at changing it, updating it, but at the moment that is still the law, and I know you've got lots to say about that, which we'll come back to. But one of the things that brought up for me is that adoption in New Zealand and most Western cultures is incredibly binary. Your birth parents are no longer your parents, and your adoptive parents are as if they were your birth parents. So the law just decides that your adoptive or adopting parents are your parents. But as Barbara, obviously you felt, the law can't actually deem something to be true when it's not true in many senses. I mean, it is true in an environmental sense that those adoptive parents raise you, but it's obviously not true in a genetic or medical, and for you, it seems certainly in an identity sense.
The Adoption Act 1955, you're absolutely right. It's based on a 17th century idea of the tabula rasa, which is the blank slate. And what I'm noticing talking about the new law is that they're taking those same concepts and putting them into the new law. So that says that you're basically a newborn child is a warm loaf of bread. It can be passed to anyone. That you come with nothing. You are only this you're only this, physical being. And I mean, I don't know, I mean, we have children. We know that, when your child is born, you look at that child and you see your entire history within that child, within their eyes. And and there's also a lot of things around, last year in 2020, there was a new study came out of Stanford that talked about how a mother and a newborn's brain, for the first 6 weeks at least, operate as one entity. That there is no us or them. That you are not a blank slate. You can't. One set of arms is not as good as another. And I know this is probably going to sound really controversial to people, but certainly within adoption circles we talk about it a lot. That one of your first sense to develop as a pre-verbal person is smell. And you're born with the smell of your mother. You know that smell. A baby will smell the mother can smell the baby. If you walk into a room and you're a breastfeeding mother, your baby will start, calling for you because they can smell you. And my earliest sense is that my adopter, and not from anything she did wrong, she just smelt wrong. And that, even to today, there's that issue sits there. And it's not fair, it's not her fault, but she's not right.
So I'd like to contrast that, because I did a little bit of research in the Jewish tradition and Jewish law about adoption. And very interestingly, in Jewish law, the position is a lot more nuanced. So Jewish law, and some of you may know this, but it was new to me, that a child never completely loses his or her birth identity. So for example, if a child is not born of a Jewish mother, but is adopted by Jewish parents, the child still has to go through a conversion process, which I did know. When I first found out about that, I felt that was really wrong, because I guess I was in this mindset that the child was part of a Jewish family. But it is a recognition as well of the child's original identity. And there's more. If the child's biological father is a Cohen or a Levi, the relevant customs of being a Cohen or a Levi apply to that child, regardless of their adopted-in family. And legally in Jewish law, although of course this doesn't practically apply because it's superseded by civil law, but legally an adopted child may marry someone from the adopting family. It's not considered incest. It's discouraged, but it is actually legal. So And if adoptive parents die, the child's not required to say Kaddish, although many do, again, as a social recognition of the importance of adopting children for many children. But it is interesting, like some of those things feel a bit weird to me, because I was like, well, the child's, got this new family. But when I talked to Barbara and read this book, it made me realise that maybe there's something in this, that actually this shouldn't be a binary issue, you're from that family or this family, but that actually that this, thousands of year old law recognises that who you are born from and who your genetic and lineal parents are remains important through your life. So I was quite impressed that this, from thousands of years old, kind of managed to have it, and our Adoption Act doesn't manage to. And that really made me think that maybe the binary way that our Western law looks at adoption is quite problematic, because it says you are one thing or you are the other thing. And similarly with a mother, that you in law can only have one. You can only have one mother. And actually it makes kind of perfect sense that you can have more than one mother or mother figure. And I'd like to talk about your mother and your mothers. You refer to your what we would call in general parlance, but I know you don't, your birth mother as Pamela, your mother, you refer to as your mother, and you refer to your adopting mother as Mavis.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what makes someone a mother and what made them a mother for you?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I would answer that by asking myself what makes me a mother. And, it's the caring, but it's also, that idea of, the day-to-day caring, but it's also that idea of this connection that doesn't matter what happens, you will not walk away from your child of any age. And I think that not all adopted people experience this, but many do, that there is we talk about adoption being performative, that you are, and you mentioned it before, that as if, and it's written into the 1955 law, that the adopting parents have to act as if this is their child. They're told it in the law. And so consequently the person that's adopted has to act as if they are the child. And so you've got these people performing parenting and performing being the child. And it's not always that way, but it is increasingly as we're starting to talk about adoption trauma, and we're recognizing it as an actual subset of traumatic experience, we are starting to recognize that this is what happens, that it is performative. And so it's not a comfortable place to be in as you grow up, even if you're not aware that you're in that place, because performing becomes very normative. You don't know yourself as a child outside of that.
So can you tell me, you knew you were adopted, but it wasn't really discussed. Can you tell me how that sense of it not being normative played out with your adopting family?
I can, and it was just about, you were supposed to know you were adopted because that was the idea at the time. But in my family, you weren't allowed to talk about it. And, my situation was particularly uncomfortable, I guess. And not every adopted person has that. But one of the things that every adopted person has is that they are legally removed from their family. You're legally not allowed your help, any kind of medical information. You're legally not allowed your files. You are legally not, that's something else. So what I'm trying to say is I don't really like to go into the unfortunateness of my situation, because not everybody experiences that, but every adopted person experiences these other issues. So one of the things we experience, for instance, is if you're a non-adopted person and your parents or your grandparents are British, for instance, you can use what's called your long form birth certificate, which is a certificate that informs your birth certificate. You can use that to get a British passport. It's very simple. It's a very simple process. As an adopted person, so my parents and my grandparents were all British, but I'm severed from that, so I cannot access that long form birth certificate. I can't get British citizenship. My children can't do that either, or my grandchildren, whereas they would have if it hadn't been severed. Now, my adopting parents, if their parents were British, I also can't access that because I have no long form birth certificate with my grandparents. My adopters' parents, my adopting grandparents, are not legally my grandparents. If they choose to, for instance, they give in their will, they give their inheritance to their biological grandchild and choose not to give it to their adopted grandchild, the adopting grandchild can't do anything about that. So it is a form of ownership. You are owned by your adopters and nothing else. It's not like you inherit their ancestors and their history and their culture. You just belong to your adopters.
So that idea of ancestry and lineage is obviously quite an important one in Jewish identity. And so you found out about your mother relatively, well, I think young is obviously a relative term, but when you're 23 and she died in this terrible way, but then you spent some decades looking for your father, your birth father. And of course, this is the big reveal. Can you tell us about your birth father?
Well, I spent years, my mother told her friend, who was the person who helped me find her, that my father was one person. And then I did my DNA. So I spent many years forming relationships with this family. And then, this was a Swedish racing car driver and his son, and he'd been killed racing at Le Mans, and it was all very, kind of romantic, tragic, I guess. And then I did my DNA about 4 years ago and discovered he was not my father. And through that, a cousin came up and he contacted me and he said, "What do you know about your father?" And I said, "I know nothing, but except that the man I thought was my father was a Formula One driver." And he said, "Oh, one of my great uncles was a Formula One driver." And so we did the DNA. So he said, "I'll ask his son if he can do the DNA to prove it." So his son agreed right away that he would do the DNA, and it came back, and he was not my brother. But it came back that he was not Jewish. He was not his father's son, our father's son. And so
This is a Pandora's box
oh my God,
of things. Yeah.
It is. But secrets cause more secrets.
So
and lies cause more
in
lies.
searching for your identity, you then actually uncovered that the identity story of this man who was not your brother was also false.
Yeah, he had to go to his mother and say, who was 92, and say, "Hey, Mom," and she denied it, and then he showed her the proof, and then finally she admitted it. And then, but
What did that do for your relationship with him?
Oh, gone. Yeah, gone.
So there was more loss because that was the
loss.
person you'd formed a sort of brotherly bond with.
Sort of, yes, in quite a quick way. But then the other thing that was interesting from that is that there'd been a sister, and in 1995 she'd taken her own life, and she was a writer and a journalist, and she wrote for The Face and The Guardian and all those places that I'd always wanted to write for. While I was writing for The Herald and The Metro and The Listener, which is great, but I'd always aimed for more. And I found some of her work online, and it was the strangest thing. It was like reading my own work. She had the same intonations, the same phrases. I kept thinking, did I write this? Because it was so similar to my writing style. And I found that really challenging and interesting.
And when you did find out about your father, he turns out that he is Jewish, was Jewish.
Very, yes.
And of course you'd grown up not knowing this, of course, and with no Jewish connection until arguably one of the most significant connections in your life. You are married to someone Jewish.
That's right. I mean, I'd been, like we were talking about last night, I met my husband 22 years ago, and then I met his mother, and both his parents were survivors, and I probably fell in love with her more than I fell in love with him to start with. I didn't want to say that last night because he was in the room. But, you know, and we began to argue right away. And she'd been a designer and a fashion designer in Montreal when they remade their lives. And, you know, one of the early things she said to me is she'd had a book published when she was 80, and it had won the Governor General's Award. And it was a book of short stories about sex. And it was wild sex stuff. It was threesomes and sex with ghosts. And she put her hand on me and she said, "I have a secret to tell you. They're all me." And I began to get this sense that you could have this rich life, which I'd been struggling to find, this rich intellectual life, and it began to develop from that point. And I understood then that we need role models that are relevant to us.
But it's interesting that you picked one, or maybe you picked him and his parents, maybe you picked three, that were relevant in a way that somehow your deep self knew, but you didn't have a particular explanation for it at that time, until 20 years later.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, when I met my husband, I remember he was here, he's a filmmaker, and he was here in New Zealand making a film. He's from Montreal, and it was a set-up with some friends, and mutual friends, and he was standing with his back to me talking to someone. I went through the door, and as he turned, I thought, I'm in deep shit. And I got it instantly. Took him a little longer, but, you know, I understood that this person spoke to me without a word in a way that I couldn't understand. And I'd not met any Jewish people. I'd lived in this very shut down Anglican world. So, yeah, and that from then it began. And then, you know, I was introduced to a whole world in Montreal, and we went to a dinner party quite early on in our relationship in Montreal, where everybody was around the table arguing. And I just was like, oh, I'm in this world that makes sense to me, and I was arguing back, and they weren't giving me shit for it.
It's interesting as well, and it's kind of a shame he isn't here, because I'm quite interested in asking him the reverse of that question. Is, you know, he was brought up a Jewish guy in Montreal, and he's probably had a Jewish mother like, you know, many of us, who was like, I want you to find someone Jewish, and then he picks you, who's not Jewish, but obviously has these characteristics that, I mean, I'm not saying, you know, we had a discussion about stereotypes in the last session for people who were there, and, you know, take that as read. But, you know, it seems like there was something there that both of you sought without really knowing. So how did you feel when you then found out your original father was Jewish?
My DNA came back 52% Ashkenazi. So my mother obviously had a little bit somewhere, but in my father's family, the Finkelsteins, or, you know, I was so in his line, I'm the first only half Jewish person. But I don't know, I mean, I guess we both recognized each other, because he had quite a playboy lifestyle. I can say this without him in the room, as a filmmaker. So, you know, and he hadn't been with Jewish women, much to his mother's mishigas about it. She was not happy about that at all. And I think she really loved me, but as I said yesterday, she was very suspicious of me because she didn't see me as Jewish. And I think that was it was confusing, because clearly I am, and certainly as time has gone on, I understand it to myself that I am. And I think she recognized that, and certainly how I parent is like that, if you ask my daughters. Yeah, so adoption's a very confusing thing when it does this, because it takes you out of, it puts you into a binary world, as you were saying, and it takes you out of that broad history. Our ancestors, and I was saying last night, you know, I believe that they want us as much as we want them, that there is a through line that matters in any culture.
And it is also interesting, this idea of identity, which I think you touched on last night, the idea of epigenetic memory. It's, you know, it's increasingly understood. It's still not very well understood by me, at least, so you'll have to forgive me my level of discussion about this. But I think it's an important point that when we are born, we it appears that we are born with some kind of memory or identity that we don't yet recognise. And one of the things that your story about growing up and not really being able to talk about adoption and your loss triggered for me, and again, I'm always wary of this analogy, but as the granddaughter of Holocaust survivor parents, there was always this trauma happened, but you can't talk about it kind of thing, which I see people nodding. I think a lot of people of my generation and the generation above experienced. And I know that as a teenager, I began having Holocaust dreams. And I found it incredibly upsetting because I had never suffered this particular trauma. In fact, my mother had never, she was born just after the war, had never directly suffered it. So this comes down, and I thought I was going crazy. And I remember I didn't tell my mother for 25 years. Like, I only told her quite recently because I was kind of ashamed that I felt like I was experiencing a memory that I hadn't earned. And that to me quite resonated with your adoption story, this idea that there is an identity in you, but you
So they're my two great-great-grandparents. And I, like you, I had those dreams all the time. They weren't Holocaust ones, but I was aware of a sense of tragedy and of struggle, and it wasn't the struggle that my adopters' families had experienced, which is a very different experience. And I had this, my adopting mother used to say to me all the time, "Oh, you make everything into a drama." And I used to feel really bad about that, and I would try and control myself so that I didn't make everything into a drama, because I was always wrong. I was always, I don't know. And what did he do? He was a master tailor, he was a silk merchant with a store on the high street in Whitechapel.
I'm like, where did this come from?
Where does that come from? I can't tell you where it comes from, other than that idea that I now have that our ancestors want us as much as we want them, that there is a living family tree that we are all part of. And then I started thinking about, my husband's story. He has no cousins, everybody was lost, so, which is such a common story. And I think all we have, where we have this, as this huge history, I even don't want to say as Jewish people, because I'm nervous about including myself in it, but we have this history that is all about loss, and yeah.
I'm giving you permission to include yourself in it.
Okay.
Because I think our binary way of looking, are you in or not, is a lot of problems.
So all we have is our genealogy, actually. When there's a pogrom that comes, what do we take? jewellery if we're lucky, if we get to keep it, and a genealogy. That's it.
And this
We lose everything.
raises a couple of other interesting questions, which could be a whole nother session. So stay tuned for next Limmud about the process of, to me, conversion when people come into Judaism. So my husband converted, and I regard him. I mean, he is completely Jewish, and we all know that in halakha you are not ever meant to refer to someone's converted status because it's seen as humiliating them. But the reality is, my husband does not have the genetic identity that I have. So to the extent that there are, the only bit you do have is that, not the only bit, that's unfair, but you have that bit. And I notice with my husband, who's Jewish and very immersed in Jewish life, that bit, sometimes I look at him and I go, where did you come from? It's quite lucky in some ways because he doesn't have a lot of the neurotic things. He doesn't have Holocaust dreams. I'm hoping the kids' chance of Holocaust dreams have been halved. There's lots of sort of good things about that. But it is interesting that we have this, even coming into Judaism, this quite binary view. You weren't a Jew, now you are a Jew. And some of those things don't recognise the complexities of what identity is really about. And I'd like again to turn back to the Adoption Act, but you'll have to let me speak first, even though I know you have a lot to say about what's changing. But I'm really interested in your idea of how it could be. So when we started talking about the changes to the Adoption Act, I know you're quite disappointed with some of the proposals because they don't seem to change the fundamental underlying binary relationship. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very good summary, yes.
So I'm really interested in what I thought at the time was a very novel proposal, which, if I've understood it correctly, is instead of adoption, a kind of permanent, enduring guardianship by the adopting, for want of a better word, family. Tell us about that.
Well, an enduring guardianship that does not take away identity, that does not give you a new birth certificate with your adopters as birth parents, that does not remove you from your family tree. Because we are taken from adoption. One of the things we don't seem to understand in general about adoption is that it's not welfare. It's not a piece of welfare legislation. We have other legislation that takes care of children in need. And we have, a foster system which actually only allows you to move from either back to your natural family or into adoption. And I think that's wrong. It should be into enduring guardianship. But the Adoption Act is completely binary and doesn't allow for that. It doesn't allow for you to be part of anything else. You have to belong to your adopters.
And so this is where I think maybe we're talking about something, your idea of enduring permanent guardianship. Again, when I first read that, I was like, that seems really unfair to the adopting family, and will they be considered parents, and all these questions. But maybe these are exactly the questions we have to grapple with to move away from this binary model that deprives a child of their identity.
If you realise that adoption is not welfare, you have to ask yourself, what is it? And I believe, my personal belief is that it's, and now that I've studied the creation of that act and how it came into being, that it is actually property legislation. And what it does is it ensures that it ensures legitimate succession for men, for fathers, so that their property remains within their legitimate heirs, and there's no incursion by illegitimate heirs. So you could say it is welfare, but it's welfare for men who can't keep it in their pants, basically. It really isn't about the child. We're told it's always about the child, but I don't believe that it is. I think that it is it's a social engineering construct to resolve a problem.
So again, I went back and looked at the Jewish position on how adoption, because I was aware there'd always been Jewish adoption in the law. But when I looked at it, the actual word is not adoption. The word is apotroposim, which are guardians. So in Jewish law, what is appointed by the court are permanent, enduring guardians. And the original, who take on the halachot that parents owe to their children, you teach your child to swim and to read Torah and so forth, but the child is still recognised as the birth child of its original parents. And I'm like, well, if we could do it then, and of course Māori do it in a slightly different way, and other cultures do it, maybe the law can learn a thing or two and to move from this property-based transaction to be more inclusive. And then I think the position I also came to, and interested in your view on this, is that for adopting parents, are they then losing something by not being the parents? But in fact, the more I read about your story and talk to you, it's actually a real burden on adopting parents as well.
It is.
At the moment.
It is, because they have to act as if that they are the parents. And, you know, as much as I wanted my mother's arms and my mother's smell and my mother's milk, and, you know, I'm obviously, you know, then I'm taken from her at birth, and there's a whole other story about how we treated single mothers for many years and how we removed babies directly from their wombs in many, many, many cases. I think, you know, the adopting mother looks into the eyes of this child, and I've done that with my own children, and what does she see? She doesn't see a reflection of herself. She sees a stranger. And it's two strangers who then have to somehow meet each other and connect without any of the benefit of hormones, of the long 9 months of getting to know each other, of being aware of each other's heartbeats. I mean, all those things are missing. It's a really difficult process, I think, and it's as difficult for the adopters as it is for the person who's adopted. But it's the person who is adopted who carries the largest burden, I believe, because they've lost everything forever. It's still the only contract, and it looks like the new law is going to continue that. It's the only contract in New Zealand where a human being is an object and subject, but not party to the contract. And it's the only contract that you can never opt out of. You have no right in this country. Australia's starting to change that. You have no right to annul it. You have to go to the only way you can do it is to go to the Attorney General, who will give you leave to approach the High Court. It's happened a few times and has never been successful. There's one going through right now that will be very interesting to see if he's successful, but it just went, the judge just threw it back and wanted more questions, and so there's no intrinsic right to your identity. If you haven't got an intrinsic right to your identity, what do you have a right to?
And I'm changing my mind about something that I wasn't going to mention, but I now am. I have some personal experience of this with embryo donation. We had leftover embryos from our IVF treatment and donated them, and there is a child, and which we were very happy to obviously do voluntarily, and we do not regard ourselves as the parent of that child. But that is the only other law where the child born of that has no rights to even the knowledge that that is how they were created into their own identity. And to me, being responsible for the creation of that child, that was the one thing I felt incredibly uncomfortable about, that you've now put a child in a position where they have no right to their original identity. And what most disappointed me about this is it's new legislation. This only came into force, and it was passed in 2004, and it came into force just after that. And so this is 50 years after the Adoption Act, and they still can't get it right.
And it's continuing in the new Act.
Yeah, and that is quite distressing, that we've not learnt.
Yeah, and we're not going to learn. I mean, there's a thing we talk about in adoption circles called genetic bewilderment. And I think genetic bewilderment is a really interesting term, because it is something that I know I've lived with, and I now am in the new work I'm doing as part of a doctorate. I'm talking about, I'm researching and looking into how we make identity, and not just as adopted people, but through third-party conception. And just what I'm really wanting to do is just change the focus to those people who are created or acquired, rather than the creators and the acquirers, which is still, we're really just taking we're taking the old legislation and we're just dumping it into some new one that makes it easier to acquire and to adopt.
I am aware that we are closing in time. Yeah, questions. I would.
Well, not a question. It probably will be. But I just want to start off by saying that I was a family court judge and did preside over adoptions in the 80s and 90s. And I know exactly what you're talking about. At that stage, we adopted a policy where a person seeking information as to their could apply to a judge, and the judge had the discretion to open a file. You couldn't get a family court judge to do it. It was very, very, very difficult. And we adopted with the principal family court judge a procedure where we would work with social welfare, who would contact the parents, the natural parents, and if everything was all right, the introduction was made through the social welfare department. Because at that stage, the social welfare department recognised the 1955 Adoption Act was wrong. The principles were wrong, and it was acknowledged by them, and so they would provide that service to try and rectify the mistakes that they had made. Now, I'm sorry that that hasn't proceeded because it had no legal, very limited legal justification, but nobody, of course, would appeal. My first case as a lawyer was in the Maryland court, and it was an adoption case. In those days, it slightly preceded the implementation of the Adoption Act in full. Maori adoptions were through the Maryland court, so that you could, I suspect, the reason is that they could then keep a record of their whakapapa and the right to Maori land. Now, when I was a judge, I would always insist upon a Maori social workers report. They weren't doing that, but it had to be a Maori social workers report. I would ask, how did this adoption affect the Maori child's right to land? I never ever got an answer from anyone.
You don't.
Well, a great question.
I got involved with surrogacy, and I wrote a judgment in which I said they had to keep a record of the donor that would be available if necessary to the child. Because under the European Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I don't know whether it applies to the United Nations Convention, a child has a right to the knowledge of that child's heritage.
I think that's a really interesting point, that's recognised, David, that's recognised as a right, that there is a right to heritage.
Yes,
It is in the UN.
that it's in the United Nations Convention. And if our Adoption Act is passed and doesn't recognise that right, then it may be possible to attack it in court.
Interesting.
Secondly,
It's a very interesting point.
the other issue I think you should raise is the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, we hear all about the land rights. What about individual rights? And of Maori children who will now be subjected to this new Adoption Act, losing their rights to the whakapapa. Why do we insist upon that? And why doesn't the Maori oppose that? Because it seems to me completely contrary to their culture. Because when I looked into it, at that time I found that Maori and Samoan did not have adoption as we
know it.
It was guardianship. And I found out the same with regard to the Jewish law. It was guardianship. And we suggested many times that they should be seeking guardianship with limited rights of contact, if you like, rather than adoption. Anyway, I'm sorry to take up all your time.
No, that was fascinating.
There's a couple of
Making these
points.
points, and I think if the government is going to just recreate the Adoption Act of 1955, then they're going to make they're just perpetuating these problems. And maybe it's symptomatic of our society because we have a shocking history of child abuse. So it's not just in the Adoption Act, it goes right through into our other acts. And maybe we should be reconsidering the way in which we actually approach this whole problem.
One of the things we don't do in this country is collect statistics around adopted people. So we don't have any way of knowing to what extent adopted people are more likely to suffer abuse in a non-biological home. In America, they do collect those stats, and they say that it's something like 20%, as an adopted person, you're 20% more likely to suffer abuse and neglect, and particularly sexual abuse in a non-biological home, because it's those things, and you were talking about that, you can, incest doesn't exist within an adopted home. It becomes a social thing rather than a physical thing. But also one of the things you mentioned is the discretion that judges had. Obviously, it's special reasons, is the term in law, only it's not defined in law anywhere. It's in the Act, it's not defined in law, and it's related only to adopted people. But the other point that you make is that you went to the parents, and I mean, I have an issue with that, because I think they've already made a decision that has impacted their the adopted person's life forever, it's not our place to keep other people's secrets. We have an absolute right to our identity. And if someone else has made a decision that has affected us, whether it's been coerced or forced or whatever, it's still a decision that, so I think we have an absolute right to identity that is still and will continue to be denied to us.
Any other questions, comments?
Do you think the ability now to, you talk about your DNA testing, do you think that in some ways will bypass that legal not being able to get that information by you, the individual adoptee, then to search out their own ancestry?
I think the DNA is a very interesting thing, and it does exactly that, as it did for me, but it does not alter your legal status. And I think that's the thing that's difficult. You still have a false birth certificate. So I have in writing from Birth, Deaths and Marriages, Internal Affairs, that describes my original birth certificate as essentially ornamental. It describes my legal birth certificate as a legal fiction. So somewhere between those two places, adopted people exist in this crack between essentially ornamental and legal fiction. So we don't even really exist. We are a creation and an anomaly that must be controlled, sadly.
Deborah.
Can I just thank you so much for this? I have two adopted brothers who were adopted through, in the days in the UK, my mum lost 2 children. They'll take over the place. So sorry, it's really,
Yes.
your description of looking into those children's eyes and not seeing those babies that you lost is really very poignant to me. And this whole relationship of my brothers, they never took to Judaism. It was never, obviously never in their whakapapa. It was not part of them. And because they really weren't completely embraced by a grieving mother, not her fault at all, then they related to their Judaism as a negative thing as well.
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of other things that happened in those days. The lack of counselling, the lack of understanding what adoption was. You've raised so many questions and answers for me today. Thank you.
I think that's the key thing to end on, is that this is an ongoing issue. And I know when I read Barbara's book, I was initially quite confronted. I felt like it was challenging something that I'd always, even with my own experience, accepted as the way, I guess the way things were, this model that adoptive parents should be considered full parents, and it was really unfair to them. And the more I worked through it, the more I think it was it's unfair to everyone, the current structure. It's actually unfair to all 3 sets of parties involved.
Yeah.
And if we stop looking at it as a binary solution and a property solution, we might be able to come up with something that recognises everyone's inherent and intrinsic human rights in this situation, that creates a better situation for all 3 parts of this very challenging triangle.
Let's hope so, but we're going to need some help from some of the senior members in the community in terms of the new law. Just to finish on, I think there's copies of my book. I think Unity
yes.
have put a wee stand there. Sorry to say
And
that.
it is actually just a great read as well. I really recommend it. So please go and have a look. Tree of Strangers. Please enjoy. One quick comment at the back. Someone looks desperate to.
Quick question. Just what is happening at the moment in terms of the new law, and how can that be intervened, or?
There's going to be there's going to be a consultation process. I've tried to get on the working group within government. I was working with Andrew Little when he was Minister of Justice. Chris Farfoy wants nothing to do with me, won't even meet with me, but as the new minister. But so there, and the working group has no one with lived experience on it, which I find just outrageous. But there will be a consultation process, which is a form of democracy, whether or not that actually, we're going to be consulting on already preconceived and established norms, rather than having this, what I believe we need, which is a big public conversation about what these things, what adoption really is. So please, when that public consultation comes up, if you just put adoption law reform into your browser, you'll get that.
So you're all now part of the conversation by virtue of joining us at Limmud.
Seem to be right for the listener, and they do every week now take one specific subject and really go
Yes.
into it. Can you not try and bring this as a subject for the listener one week?
I certainly could. I haven't been doing journalism. I've been trying to get a novel finished, 2 novels finished. I take a long time. But I am about to write something for Newsroom that will be around the law reform. Yeah.
So I hope, if nothing else, this has opened people's eyes to a different way of looking at a really old problem. So thank you for your time. Thank Barbara so much for sharing your experience and your heartfelt emotions and your Jewish journey with us today at Limmud. Yeah, I needed to do it in a way that wasn't too detailed. I mean, yeah, my husband's okay with the fact of it, just didn't want to go into too much stuff around it. The fact of it is not.